political analyst Asanda Ngoasheng now joins us via video link to weigh in on the latest developments around former President Jacob Zuma. Asanda, good afternoon and thank you for joining us here on the SABC at this hour.
Good afternoon and thank you for having me.
Asanda, there seems to be some allegations that the accident was an attempt on the former president's life. What's your thoughts?
Well, I'm not surprised that, the first thing that would happen if Jacob Zuma gets into an accident is an accusation that it was an attempt on his life, despite the fact that, first of all, it's the night before Easter. We know that many people get into car accidents at that time. And if you look at the man that's accused of having started the accident, he's said to have been a drunk driver, which again is something that we know happens the day before Easter. And so it's always interesting how politicians seem to think that things that happen to South Africans cannot happen to them. Many South Africans, every Easter, there are numbers that speak to the number of car accidents that happen, that speak to the number of drunk driving incidents that happen. And it's only when it's politicians that suddenly it's seen to be, or it's alleged to be, a hit, rather than the accidents that happen to South Africans every single Easter.
Asanda, thank you for speaking to the realities on the ground. Just because the former president's accident follows a few hours after 45 other people died in Limpopo as well. Perhaps at this point, as we look at some of the other questions that come to the fore for Police Minister Bagicele in terms of the number of personnel for the former president, seeking more protection from police, the investigation at large, what questions arise on that front?
Well, I found it quite interesting that suddenly, because there was this accident, the focus now shifts to how many people does he have in his protection, and the fact that they're saying that Jacob Zuma has a motorcade, the same motorcade he's had for 7 years. And, again, my question, and if you think about the fact that there's now allegations that it was a hit, my question becomes, who does the MK think is trying to kill them? And if it is, as they seem to suggest, that SABC or the ANC have something to do with them, I find that quite interesting, because who is protecting Jacob Zuma? It is the very same South African police service that is sitting with him, that was sitting with him in that particular car. And so I would think if somebody was going to try and take out Jacob Zuma, wouldn't it be easier to send the very same protection officers that he uses on a daily basis than to go and add another human being who could potentially lose their life? And so I think, to me, the MK is really just clutching at straws and really adding to its seeming attempts at trying to create mayhem and chaos ahead of these elections by constantly casting aspersions. I mean, we're sitting with, I was just looking now at the numbers, and in 2022, it was said that the government spent 8 billion on the South African Police Service. And of that 8 billion, 2 billion, that's almost, 1% of South Africa's GDP of 3 trillion. So 2 billion of 8 billion goes to the protection of 200 people in parliament, plus, a couple of other people who are former presidents and other people who have been identified as needing extra security. And so to be coming now and complaining about Jacob Zuma's security when South Africans are insecure, and a huge chunk of the South African budget, that is 25% of the South African budget, is going towards the protection of Jacob Zuma and other political heads and former former presidents and cabinet ministers. And I think that, we need to be asking questions, and I've said various times, we need to be asking questions about the premise under which Jacob Zuma gets this protection, and whether it still makes sense for him to receive the kind of benefits that he has been receiving, given everything that has happened when he was president, given everything that has happened in July 2021, and what is currently happening at the moment. Because it begs the question, why are we as a country continuing to protect a man who then turns around and casts aspersions on the very same services that we as South Africans are paying for? What is the point behind that?
Well, these are some of the lingering questions, Asanda. And as we also look at some of the other dynamics unfolding, we've seen former President Jacob Zuma will not be able to stand as a candidate of the MK party on the 29th of May for elections. The IEC coming out to say that there were 31 objections received from the public, alleging that 8 candidates were not eligible. Talk to us also about those dynamics unfolding.
Yeah, I also found it interesting that, literally the day after Jacob Zuma was, it was declared by the IEC that he can't stand for election because of his sentence, which, of course, it hasn't even been 5 years since he finished it or was released on, under the presidential pardon system. So I think that, we have a situation where the MK, as I've said, as far as I'm concerned, is really grappling at straws because they're finding themselves without their number one draw card that they were relying on in President Jacob Zuma. And of course, this is also classic Jacob Zuma strategies to play the victim, to, constantly create situations or use situations that happen to his advantage to show him to be a victim of others' nefarious plans. And obviously this all, in the past has shown itself to actually be him who had those nefarious plans. If we think about Jacob Zuma when he was removed from the deputy presidency by former President Thabo Mbeki, we'll see how he used that situation to his advantage and ended up creating a situation wherein everybody was turned against former President Thabo Mbeki because of the picture that he painted. And it's only after Jacob Zuma became president and was involved in state looting and various other things that he has been alleged to have done that many came out and said, we regret having believed in in his victim status, and we regret having supported him at the time because we didn't know that this is what he was going to join, he was going to get the presidency and do. And so I feel like this is yet another strategy by Jacob Zuma to say, well, we've just had a car accident. It's the day before Easter. It's the same day that the IEC said he's not allowed to be president. And suddenly there are questions around whether he's being sabotaged in terms of security, whether he deserves better security, etc., etc. I think, what's important for us to hold is that former presidents have a specified budget for security and all of their costs. And I don't think there's anything special in terms of former presidency about Jacob Zuma that he deserves to get a higher budget or a different budget to former President Thabo Mbeki, to former President Kgalema Motlanthe, and every other person that gets similar benefits. So my question is really around, I think government should clarify how much it is that they're spending in terms of security on all these different former presidents so that we can see and have clarity around how much is being spent on each president. And if indeed Zuma is not getting more money, because I suspect that he may be getting more money in terms of security compared to the other former presidents. And I base this on the fact that when I've seen the motorcades, etc., of both former President Thabo Mbeki and former Jacob Zuma, to my mind, seems to have more people in his motorcade than I've seen, former President Thabo Mbeki or even former President Kgalema Motlanthe have. And so I think this is one of those situations where SABC is going to have to come out and give us those statistics so that these aspersions that are being cast are clarified. And I think that this is going to require people to have cool heads, to start asking questions around why would it be easier, as these allegations are coming, to send someone to try and, cause a car accident than if it is indeed that they're alleging that SABC is involved in this plot. Why not just use the people who are sitting next to him and protecting him?
Asanda, speaking
if they want him dead, as the MK is alleging.
And so speaking about strategy, just as we wrap up on this closing point, another blow as well with the Supreme Court of Appeal having dismissed yet another bid by the former president to revive his private prosecution bid against state advocate Billy Downer and journalist Karen Morn. Perhaps you could just weigh in on that as we wrap up this conversation.
I mean, I think this is one of the issues. I'm glad personally that the IEC has ruled that former President Jacob Zuma cannot stand, because we need him to be available for all the many other court cases that he needs to answer for. And I believe that part of why he was involved in the MK in the first place was precisely because he's looking for avenues out of the many pending court cases. And so I think that, we may see Jacob Zuma go to jail yet again, because there are many allegations against him that still need to be tested in court. And there are many cases that still need to be finalized, which may see him back behind bars. And that wouldn't have been a good look for South Africa to have an MP, now being forced to go behind bars, and the destabilization that would have caused. But I also want to urge South Africans that we must always, I think, keep in mind the fact that, the democracy that South Africa has, the record of peace during elections that we have, is not just something that needs to be protected by the ANC, the MK, and political parties, but it is something that needs all South Africans to protect it. And anybody who stands in the way of that, and anybody who calls for violence, is threatening not just the ANC, the MK, but is threatening South Africa and South Africa's ability to have peaceful election, which has implications for our country, both in terms of how others are going to look at our country in terms of investment, but also in terms of our own, as South Africans, psychological peace when it comes to elections. We know that many African countries really have anxiety and a horrible time when it comes to election. And South Africa has been lucky so far that we haven't had that. And that's because many South Africans work behind the scenes to make sure that the violence we saw, particularly in KZN in the early 90s, doesn't happen again. And my concern is that the MK, through their utterances and various others, are stoking these fires, and we cannot allow that.